everyone. Welcome to Terror Talk.
Yo.
Today on the show, I wanted to start us off with a bit of folk horror discussion. This is a much bigger topic that I really dig. So I do also plan on, kind of like what I said last week around celebrity stalking. I feel that same way about folk horror. It's so interesting. The history of it, the different movies, the way we are so into it now. And it's endured over decades now, 5 decades of folk horror that we could talk about. And then kind of the origins and stuff. But today on the show, I'm going to talk about the Unholy Trinity, which is what the UK calls these 3 movies, which are the Unholy Trinity of the beginnings of folk horror, which is the Witchfinder General, the Blood of Satan's Claw, and the Wicker Man, which most people are really very familiar with. And some of those movies actually have some true crime inspiration from them. So I thought that would be an interesting part too.
Excellent.
So let's talk about what folk horror even is for those of you who may be like, yeah, I kind of know what that is, but let's talk a little bit about that. I saw this one quote in a documentary where it was described as the prosaic meeting the uncanny. And I thought that was really very fancy way of saying that. But it involves ancient landscapes. It illustrates the power of ritual and the collective and generational storytelling, which is one of the things I love about it, is it brings in ancient wisdoms. It's pre-Christian usually. It's also a horror that represents the repressed and the outsiders, and something that survives despite dominant culture, which I think is a very relevant thing in our society today, and why maybe folk horror is having, or has always endured, is because it's always going to represent something that sustains even when the will of the culture doesn't support it. Mm-hmm. So I think anybody who's been repressed or feels like an outsider or isn't part of the dominant culture can relate to and have some psychological experience with folk horror. Like I said, it's endured 5 decades and continues prominently now. And we're still talking about it and doing documentaries and writing articles and having Midsommar and all of that. You know, it's still very much a part of it. And I think that's because it is based in the ancient storytelling that's from our fairy tales and our dark myths and Gothic horror. There was some articles, I guess, in the 18th century that were written about Gothic horror and like novels and stuff. And that's where the term folk horror was sort of began to be talked about. And it wasn't till the 60s and 70s where they really coined that phrase for cinema with this trinity, really, in many ways. So I know that Kathy has some folky horror facts with Kath, but before we do that, I did want to just like make a little list of kind of what you can expect from folk horror, or what makes us say, oh, this is a folk horror. Besides what I just said, which is kind of the ideology around it, if it has those qualities, it's either folk horror inspired or, you know, some blend of the subgenres. It's a subgenre, as I said, and the folk horror aims to create a very atmospheric sense of fear. So your basic instincts around fear, your orientation to foreboding feelings, the anxiety that can come with, it's not overt, it's very underlying, it's it's in the atmosphere that you experience this type of horror. So it's not overt, it was a reaction in many ways to the Hammer films, which were very overt, very tropey, very like bum, bum, bum plot-wise. This was actually England's reaction to that kind of tropey horror that was very kind of overt and right there in your face and visual in that way. This was to say, this was much more underlying in that fear and sense of foreboding. There's often some kind of myth or legend that's associated with it, something from that culture's history and traditions. I've now watched a lot of what would be considered folk horror from a lot of different cultures, and I find that really interesting because it often blends with that country's culture,
sure,
those people's cultures, and brings their myths and traditions into the movie. And then that's even more scary for me because I don't know what the fuck is going on.
But I think you mentioned something really important, which is folk horror. The atmosphere is so uncomfortable, like to the point where you don't know if you want to keep watching or shut it off if it's done well, because and I know we'll talk about these later, but The Wicker Man was so incredible. The original was so incredibly disturbing.
I think that's why it's endured, because it fucks with your head, like in a big bad way.
Well, and I can see where Ari Aster got a lot of his influence from.
And that's why they call this the Holy Trinity, because a lot of folk horror has been influenced by these distinct movies and why they have endured as well. So it also often includes a connection to religion or the occult, such as witches, paganism, mystics. Sometimes there's a religious piece to it, but as you'll see in Witchfinder General, it's not a religious piece. It's really just a fucking psychopath. But it does involve witches and paganism. There's often a rural setting, so we see a lot of isolated villages, barren fields, Midsommar, claustrophobic woods. They're often the movies where you have to turn off the lights and increase the sunrise on your screen because you can't see what the fuck is going on, and then put on headphones because you're listening for the atmospheric things in the forest, because it'll be slow and creepy.
It is. And then, oh God, the ones in the 70s, the music is so off-putting.
Oh my God.
It makes you want to go crazy.
Yeah.
Not want to go crazy. It makes you go crazy. I don't want to go crazy.
Kathy has intentionally gone crazy. No, as an aside, I watched a folk horror movie that's pretty famous called Hagazusa, I think is the way it's pronounced. It's German and it's a folk horror. And I tell you, it's so dark. This movie is so dark. It's from 2017. It's in there with the like Midsommar type of, it's just so bleak. It's really good, but again, like what Kathy's saying, do I really want to? I don't know.
These are hard to watch more than once. Mm-hmm. I mean, at least these OGs.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Yeah,
the themes they often deal with a superstition, right, or sacrifice. Like in The Wicker Man, that's obviously about sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Dark aspects of nature. That's a piece of that folk horror, is nature and its powers. A lot of times it's man versus nature. Sometimes in the subgenre of the overgrown plant that kills everybody or what have you. That's not exactly folk horror, but if it's coupled with all these other things we're talking about, then it is. It can focus on really the darker side of human behavior, right? So misogyny, as in the blood on Satan's claw, is very much there. There's misogyny in Witchfinders General to a certain extent, but that's just Vincent Price being a psychopath for real. But there's a real guy that was the Witchfinder General, and then there's a real young lady that inspired the blood on Satan's claw, who was an 11-year-old killer. And I'm going to get into those two.
Okay.
And that's what we do here as we talk about the movies and then the real things that they might have been inspired by. This is the darker side of human behavior. And so often these movies are inspired by things that the filmmakers or film writers actually know what's happening. So paranoia, misogyny, outsiders entering cults and close-knit communities, as we've seen in Midsommar. Like that's a really popular example of folk horror these days. That's why I throw it in there so much right now, because it kind of is a more contemporary reference for those of you who, because that's a bunch of kids entering a cult and whoa, does shit go wrong?
Oh yeah.
It often also, and this is just the last thing I'll say about it as far as generalities for today, is it often includes some kind of supernatural entity. Witchfinders General being an exception, that it doesn't have not a supernatural folk horror, but often they're associated with the natural environment. It'll be like a demon or an entity that we're sacrificing, or a entity that possesses somebody in the community and then wreaks havoc, and then maybe it spreads from person to person, stuff like that. It usually focuses on beliefs and actions of people rather than the supernatural. The supernatural just come in and fuck things up like a trickster.
Always.
Yeah. But,
But,
again, occult, pre-Christian cultures, you get the idea.
Yeah.
All right. Let's do, for a little lightness on this topic, let's do a little thing that we like to call
Folky Facts with Pearl.
Okay.
Number 1, in the Blair Witch Project.
Yes, ma'am.
What is the meaning of the pile of rocks in The Blair Witch.
Okay.
Number 2. How much did Christopher Lee get paid for starring in The Wicker Man? Number 3. This short story, and I'm going to give you 3 options for this, is what the film Antlers is based on. Is it A, Harvest Home, B, The Twisted Ones, or C, The Quiet Boy?
Can't wait to find which ones you made up.
Number 4. This folk horror film has a unique take on curses and zombies.
Okay.
And this one you already know, but I will read it.
Did I say something?
The plot of this folk horror revolves around bizarre remains being unearthed in the 1700s, which consequently sees a group of children in a nearby village and becomes devil worshippers.
I don't know, Kathy.
I don't know either. You're going to have to tell me.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about Witchfinder General. Have you seen this movie at all?
I have not seen that.
Okay, you might, well, I don't know. I don't know if enjoy is the right word. But this is a 1968 British period folk horror film, and it was directed by Michael Reeves and starring Vincent Price. So that's a pretty heavy hitter. Michael Reeves was a young filmmaker at the time, and I mentioned before that these folk horror movies were often an answer to the Hammer horror that had been coming out, and they wanted something a little more rebellious in their horror, a little more subculture, a little more occult, and they wanted to go in that direction. And Michael Reeves was an example of that. Like, as a young director, that was pretty much what he wanted to do. And Vincent Price is amazing in this film, by the way. He's
always good.
Fucking bastard. So the film is heavily fictionalized, of course, but it is based on the murderous witch hunting exploits of a guy named Matthew Hopkins, who Price plays. But for the movie's sake, a lawyer falsely claimed to have been appointed as the Witchfinder General by Parliament, this is the real story, during the English Civil War to root out sorcery and witchcraft. It was for profit, but we'll get into that. Keep in mind that this came out in 1968. This is the only one of these films to come out during a actual war period. I believe, shit was happening in our real life when this came out, so it hit a lot harder. But the plot is that in 1645, during the English Civil War, Matthew Hopkins, an opportunistic witch hunter, takes advantage of the breakdown in social order to impose a reign of terror over East Anglia. Hopkins and his assistant, John Stern, visit various villages to torture confessions out of suspected witches, and they charge the local magistrates for the work they carry out. So that is the basic plot. This is literally Vincent Price as the Witchfinder General going around the country torturing witches, quote unquote, torturing women. So this has a lot of that in it.
Torturing women?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah. There's a lot of paranoia, of course, because they're playing on the paranoia. We all know what that's like, right? We play on the paranoia of the culture to further our agenda. There's a lot of misogyny. There's a lot of, like I said, speaking up in opposition to Hammer horror, not wanting to revisit those kind of repetitive tropes from them. There's a pushback against those Gothic tropes in this, that tightly woven script that Hammer horror would have with no subtlety or comment on the culture. They wanted to have that. And so there's no supernatural in this. This is really about the corruption of the establishment and during the Vietnam War. So if you're watching this now, you might get triggered by the corruption of the establishment. But granted, this was in 1968 during the Vietnam War, and there was a real witchfinder. It's kind of about unchecked power.
Okay.
Of course, in reality, the movie's about burning and hanging innocent women.
Which is really a metaphor.
But there's a metaphor for unchecked power. Like if power is unchecked, if you give this guy, the Witchfinder General, the power to, at will, go around the country and accuse women, torture them, and then kill them as he sees fit, that is unchecked power.
Looks like this movie was remade in 2009.
Yeah. The filmmakers call it a nihilistic Western, and there is a lot of nihilism in this. It's very bleak. It's very bleak. But I mean, Vincent Price, he was not the person they originally wanted for this part, but I just love him, and I think he does a great job. But it does amplify how violence really just infects everything, honestly. It just... And nihilism being the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. In case you didn't know what nihilism is, there's a cynicism, there's a pessimism to it. You know, nihilism is a lot about extreme skepticism. So, yeah. It reminded me, actually, Kathy and I have watched this movie a couple of times that's widely regarded as one of the grossest movies ever.
Oh God, I know where she's going with this.
Sodom.
Yeah.
And it's not that weird, and it's not that long and strange with no plot. But it's got some flair of that to it.
Okay, I can see that.
There isn't like a lot of the sexualized content that's in that movie, thus the name, but this has got a little bit of that flavor to it. But I can say that it's a nihilistic Western, so there's this like Western component to it. Yeah. He's like tramping around on his horse, you know, Vincent on his horse with his hat. But I did want to talk a little bit about the real Witchfinder general. He and his associates are believed to have been responsible for the death of 300 women accused of witchcraft between 1644 and 1646 for the 2 years. So the kingdoms of Scotland and England were united in 1603 when King James VI of Scotland also became James I of England. So James certainly had a strange fascination with all things associated with the occult. He releases this book called Demonology, which explored the areas of witchcraft and demonic magic. And he was so obsessed with the black arts that he even convinced Parliament to pass the Witchcraft Statute of 1604, which ruled witchcraft as a crime punishable by death. This background led to a heightened public anxiety about witches. So this is what we're talking about, like paranoia, unchecked power. It's like there was a public anxiety created, which is pretty easy to do, about witches that would fester for decades that followed. And the channel in mainland Europe, it crossed borders. It was all over Europe and the UK at the time. And within the political and religious chaos that ensued basically throughout the English Civil Wars, I don't think someone like Matthew Hopkins could have come about or emerged if there wasn't that paranoia and that cultural fear that had been created by the leadership, obviously. Records of Hopkins' early career in the art of witchcrafting are vague. However, it seems to be that he moved to Essex in 1644. He was an impoverished lawyer with a strong puritanical background, shocker. And he appears to have seen it as his mission to destroy anything to do with the works, quote unquote, works of the devil. And so Hopkins believed that there were several witches regularly practicing their dark arts close to his home. And apparently he began his career as a witchfinder after he overheard various women discussing their meetings with the devil in 1644.
Oh. Okay.
That seems like a fabrication, but okay.
You think?
Of the 23 women accused of witchcraft, 4 were said to have died in prison, with 19 years later convicted and hanged. Hopkins appears to have assumed the title of Witchfinder General in 1645, claiming to be officially commissioned by Parliament with the brief to uncover and prosecute witches. So together with his entourage, that included a merry band of lady prickers, they called them. They traveled the villages and towns of eastern England, trying and examining women for witchcraft.
Examining?
Oh, yeah. There's a bit of examining in the movie.
Oh, of course there is.
Yeah, they would prickers, the lady pricker, they would poke them with these long steel bars like into their spines.
I mean, we haven't evolved that much
since 1645.
No.
We're still lady pricking.
Yeah.
Okay. Kathy will tell that story later.
Yeah.
Of course, all of this came at a very quote unquote reasonable price, said to be 20 shillings a town. So you could hire Mr. Hopkins to come to your town to rid it of all the witchcraft. So you see how this is a political piece. Does it sound familiar? We hire people to come in and further our political agenda at the dismay and violence of the oppressed.
Oh,
that's why
yes, that's what I'm saying. It hasn't really evolved.
Folk horror. This is what it's based in. Marginalized communities that are not in line with the dominant culture.
It's supposed to be an escape from reality, and it's not an escape from reality.
Are disavowed. And this is how we process this, is by making movies about it. Although the records reveal that the small market town of Stowmarket paid £23 for his services, but it was around 20 shillings usually. He was an entrepreneur. He was well paid. It was obviously a business for him. Who knows where the psychopathy began and where the business all blended? I don't know. But Hopkins' favorite confessional method of torture was the infamous swimming test, as most of our culture will be familiar with. Unbelievably simple but effective test involving binding the arms and legs of the accused to a chair before throwing them into the village pond. And if they sank and drowned, they were innocent and received into heaven. And if they floated, they would be tried as a witch. So you either died or you died.
That's right.
Yep.
I've heard this one before.
Yep, most people have. So between the years of 1644 and 1646, Hopkins and his band of people are believed to have been responsible for the death of 300 women. And in the days when an average farm worker's wage was 6 pence a day, 6 pennies, it's estimated that Hopkins may have collected fees of around £1,000 for his gruesome services. So that's a lot. That is a king's ransom of those days. And he even wrote a short pamphlet detailing his witch hunting methods, which some of you may be familiar with, and it's called The Discovery of Witches, which was published in 1647. His own end, however, is far from clear. Nobody sort of knows. Some accounts say he drowned and undergoing his own swimming trial after being accused of witchcraft himself. But wouldn't that be a lovely little wind up to the story? But I don't really know if that's true. But I wanted to talk about the real Witchfinder, because the Witchfinder general movie is loosely based on it. Obviously, these are not real accounts, but there was a real guy.
Okay.
So the second movie in the Unholy Trinity is The Blood on Satan's Claw, and this is a 1971 British supernatural period folk horror film directed by Piers Haggard and starring Patrick Wymark, Linda Hayden, and Barry Andrews. And it's set in the 18th century England, and it follows the residents of a rural village whose youth fall under the influence of a demonic presence after a local farmer unearths a mysterious deformed skull buried in a field. That obviously has a lot of folk vibes, but it was also 1970, so Satanic Panic was around, so it played on that. It's sort of that folk horror idea of the mysterious power of the fields and the land and the countryside, and how that's connected to folklore and rituals and good and evil. It also had the terror of female sexuality. There's a lot of scenes where men being afraid of women seducing them and young girls seducing them. And it also had this but this agenda or comment on youth rising up against the establishment. And you'll see this over and over and over again in folk horror of corruption of establishment, youth going against establishment. Again, things that are not part of the dominant culture going against the dominant culture, and often losing quite a bit, honestly, because these are, again, like we've said, bleak movies. But I want to talk a little bit about Mary Bell, because Mary Bell is an English woman who, as a juvenile, killed 2 preschool-aged boys in her suburban town in 1968. She was 11.
Oh, God.
Bell committed her first killing when she was 10 years old, And in both incidents, Bell informed her victim that he had a sore throat, which she would massage before proceeding to strangle them.
Oh, God.
Convicted.
How do you learn that by 11?
Yeah. So one of the most disturbing things about Mary Bell was that she was convicted. She was tried and arrested, charged, tried and convicted of manslaughter in relation to both of these killings, but she was 11. And one of the more disturbing things was that she was pretty psychopathic. She had no remorse. She was diagnosed at that age with psychopathic personality.
Oh, wow.
Britain's youngest female killer. She had an alleged accomplice in at least one of the killings, which is her 13-year-old friend, that was acquitted of all charges. But so in this movie, The Blood on Satan's Claw, there is a young girl who murders in the woods and things. So it's loosely based on that. And I wanted to mention this case because she was actually released from custody in 1980 at the age of 23 and had a lifelong court order granting her anonymity, which has since been extended to protect the identity of her daughter and granddaughter. So they all live under a series of pseudonyms. It was really disturbing for the court, I guess, to have an 11-year-old in court that had no remorse, no emotion, nothing to say about it, and did not feel bad about what she had done. So that was new for them. And it influenced this character. I believe the character's name is Angel in the movie, but we could talk more about Mary Bell at some time in the future if anybody is interested, because there's more to her story. But I did want to bring up that when you're watching, if you've never watched The Blood on Satan's Claw, it's pretty chilling, and it's got a young female kid who kills. So enjoy that. We talk about a lot of those.
Well, some people like that stuff. I don't know who would ever really like that stuff.
We've only talked about it at least 15 times.
Right. A season.
All right. And so the last movie in the Unholy Trifecta is the very, very, very famous The Wicker Man. 1973 British folk horror. Christopher Lee. We'll find out how much he made for this movie in a minute. But the plot centers on the visit of a police officer, Sergeant Neil Howie, to the isolated Scottish island of Summer Isle in search of a missing girl. Howie's a devout Christian. He's appalled by what he finds there and the inhabitants because they've abandoned Christianity and now practice some form of Celtic paganism. And I know when this movie was made, it was unique. I mean, we've seen a lot of movies about this now, but it was unique because the horror was missing old religions at the time. So there wasn't a ton about like paganism and the old religions. There was a lot of like Christian folk horror, whether Christians were corrupt and this, that, or the other. And this was actually more about old, we see it a lot actually in movies in general, but certainly in folk horror now, where there's this old money aristocracy and they're the villains, and there's this aristocratic corruption. And of course, as you can imagine, if you know anything about English culture, that's even more pronounced, this aristocracy, this moneyed figurehead families, old families. And they reappear here, and there's these pagan, the pagan beliefs and the sacrifice, this horrific pagan ritual that happens, and the trying to go back to old ways. And there's this community that's like really trying to go back to the pre-Christian times, and how disturbing that must have been, because The Wicker Man has been so famous and so popular ever since, that I'm imagining this movie really just made a mark. And Christopher Lee's performance, I mean, really good.
This movie was really something else. And I think that I actually could have done a whole trivia show on how they put this film together.
Yeah, you bet.
Even the scene at the end, the lead actor, I can't think of his name right now, who is looking at the Wicker Man. Mm-hmm. He didn't see that until that scene. So his reaction was real.
I think it's Edward Woodward.
Yeah, his reaction was real. That movie, I can see a lot of Midsommar influence in
Yeah.
that film, and just the way the community is built.
Mm-hmm.
There's some really fun facts about the main woman too, who does the naked dance at the beginning.
Yeah.
And that was a body double, and she didn't know it. She didn't know they were going to use a body double. And so when she left the scene for the day of shooting, they brought in another car, and it was this woman who was like a stripper or something. They had her lay on the floor of the car so she didn't see her come in.
Oh,
Then she was the body double for that scene. And her boyfriend almost like left her for doing this. There's a lot of drama around the making of The Wicker Man.
Drama.
But the movie itself, from the music to the shots to the acting to the atmosphere, like I was so uncomfortable from beginning to end. And then even like the animal screams and all that was awful. But
I think that's why it's a successful folk horror in that way.
Yeah.
Meaning it's right in line with the genre. It has all the ideals of the genre. It has all the message of the genre. It's very clear in what it is, and also it very much succeeds in that uncomfortable, eerie, atmospheric thing that folk horror is trying to disturb in you, which I think is really cool. It's like there was one film magazine, I guess, that called it the Citizen Kane of horror movies but it's only 88 minutes long, so it can't be Citizen Kane because.
no.
Citizen Kane's a bit longer, but it also has a lot of that Easter eggs and meanings and all of that. It's a situation where there wasn't a lot of this kind of movie at the time. And so
That's true.
it poked a lot of buttons.
Yes.
And
I
it
can
had
imagine.
it had Christopher Lee. So very famous, right? Very famous actor guy. The remake, starred Nick Cage.
I heard it was not good.
No, it's not good.
I haven't
I mean,
seen it.
I do love the Nick Cage.
Me too. I
but-
just heard the movie was not good.
Yeah, it wasn't received very well. It was in 2006, so it's not a great era
Yeah.
of horror, really.
That's true. It
Some
really
people
wasn't.
would disagree with me on that, but of course there were amazing movies in the aughts, but it was an odd time, honestly, in horror, and that one really did not go well. But I guess in 2011 there's a spiritual sequel called The Wicker Tree, and it is also directed by Robin Hardy, who's the original director of The Wicker Man, but I have not seen that one. So
Okay.
anyway, I wanted to talk about all of that because, again, with most of the things I get interested in, I wanted to do an episode on folk horror, and we've done it before where we just kind of spitballed and talked about movies we'd seen. But I wanted to go a little bit more into the history of it and a little bit more foundational and what it is and who it is. And I do want to go forward with this in some kind of way. If you guys have ideas, I have a few ideas about how I'd like to continue to talk about folk horror. So we'll do that in season 7 as well. As you can see, this summer is often us like trying out things we kind of want to do. And we do that in the mini cast too,
There's so much even modern. Like one of my favorite folk horror that came out last couple of years was Lamb.
Yeah, great one.
Oh God, talking about disturbing and
Yes.
pulled on all of the emotions.
Great one. And there's just so many of those. So along the way, I would like to find a way to do more folk horror specific episodes where I can talk about the storytelling and the folklore and the dark gothic literature and all the things that it's all based on, because it's really my jam and I dig it so much. So
Cool.
I appreciate it. But
Yeah.
let's get some answers.
Folky folks with folks.
What was that?
We're folks. We're talking about folk. And the Blair Witch Project. In the Blair Witch Project, what is the meaning of the pile of rocks?
I really don't remember. It's been a long time since I saw that movie.
The witch was warning them about not respecting her limits. Always a witch.
So it was a warning.
It was a warning.
Okay, got it.
Number 2, how much did Christopher Lee get paid for starring in The Wicker Man?
$5,000.
This man did it for free.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He's an actor, Shannon. He saw a
Why did he do it for
piece
free?
of art and he said, I'm going to give myself to you.
Well, that doesn't happen anymore.
There's probably a curse on him.
I mean, they only had a £500,000 budget, so.
Yeah. Number 3, this short story is what the film Antlers is based on. Is it Harvest Home, The Twisted Ones, or The Quiet Boy?
I think it's The Quiet Boy?
It is.
Oh my gosh.
And the other two are actually real short stories, just not.
Oh, you didn't make those up?
I did not. They're too sane.
They didn't have
It
like
didn't say like booby poop or anything.
and poops. I was just going to say they didn't
Titty
have like...
twister.
Yeah, they didn't have boob or poops or pee. And
Nacho fart and the Quiet Boy. Okay. Number 4, this folk horror film has a unique take on curses and zombies. We've talked about this movie
I'm
on our
sure
show.
there's so many though. It's not coming to mind.
Serpent in the Rainbow.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, no, that was not one of the ones I was thinking of.
And then the plot of this folk horror revolves around bizarre remains being unearthed in the 1700s, which consequently sees a group of children in a nearby village becomes devil worshippers.
The blood on Satan's claw.
That is correct.
Yay. Thank you so much for adding to that, Kathy. We appreciate your facts.
I appreciate you.
This has been an episode of Terror Talk, and my name is Shannon.
And I'm Kathy. Sleep safe, everyone.